Testing, testing, testing. Blah, 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 blah.
Ready, set, go.
It's time for the Coach Amy and Coach Liz show.
A podcast for endurance athletes by two athletes, two coaches, and a physical therapist.
We are your hosts, Coach Amy
And Coach Liz.
coming to you from Kansas City. Hello, peeps. We're back.
Hi.
You guys should see Liz here. First of all, her legs are crossed, which you're not supposed to sit with your legs crossed.
I always sit with my legs crossed.
And she has a blankie.
Well,
She's sitting here with a red blankie over her lap. Is it cold in here?
do you need to ask the question?
Liz is always
This
cold.
is the summer nightmare. Like, as soon as it finally gets warm enough out, everybody wants to turn on their AC, and it's like this, it's an
You guys,
ongoing.
it's 72 degrees in here. And Liz
My
has,
point exactly. Like, what are we doing? You say that
Liz
like
has
it's
on a
balmy.
long sleeve.
You sit here. You are wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt, and normally you're like running around in small items.
But it's actually not because I feel cold. Like, I've got this pulled up against my elbow, and I'm actually sweating underneath here. I'm sweating. It's probably
You're fired.
All right. So, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about FTP.
Okay. What does FTP stand for?
Okay, so FTP is what we call your functional threshold power, which sounds like it's an unnecessarily fancy word for something that's pretty basic. But if you break down the terms, you've got functional, meaning that it's like something that's not just like you can test it in a lab, but it's functional, meaning you've done it. We get it from the field, right? It's a functional thing that your body has done. Threshold just means it's like you're on the threshold. How hard can you go? And then power is we're talking about power meter, which is something that you use on the bike. Power meter, if you're not familiar, basically it's something that measures how hard your legs are working. So when we're talking about functional threshold power, we're talking about a measurement of how hard the muscles in your legs can work. And the idea is to capture how hard they can go for an hour is the idea of FTP.
So it's the amount of power that you are able to generate in an hour and what your heart rate is showing, right? But that threshold, by threshold, what is the number that you're getting? What's that threshold?
Well, so when you do when you would be measuring your functional threshold power, that would be one number. You would also measure your lactate threshold heart rate with it. So they're two different numbers, right? But they are both like that lactate threshold heart rate is measuring what your heart rate is when you go maximum for an hour.
And how much power you generate.
Those are two
at the
different
same
things.
time. Well, but isn't our normal FTP number doesn't... Oh, okay.
Because it's going to get confusing because people confuse those things.
Oh, okay.
So you are measuring two different things. You are measuring your heart rate, then you are also measuring what your legs can do. And so if you say your FTP, your functional threshold power, you're just talking about what your legs can do.
Okay.
It does not automatically include what your heart rate can do. You want to measure both at the same time, but they are two different things.
Okay.
And so in triathlon and in cycling, people get really hung up on like what your FTP is. So for those of you that are runners, like if you think about like, it might be the equivalent of like what your 10K time would be. Like a 10K is usually run at like pretty much your threshold. It's a hard effort. Depending on your pace, it's going to last, 30 to 60 minutes. But you kind of have... there's similar concepts there.
Okay.
And if you were going to do that for running, you would want to measure your heart rate, but you would also measure your pace, and you'd be really interested in what your pace is. So when we're talking about power on the bike, power is not pace, to be clear. That gets confused. Maybe we'll touch on it at the end. But what we are getting when we are measuring that power is a number that reflects how hard your legs can work. So to give people just sort of an idea of what that looks like, say your FTP for somebody that's like maybe, most people that I work with, would be somewhere around like say 100 would be your FTP.
Okay. What are the units? 100
watts. So it's a watt. So like 100 watts might be your FTP, functional threshold power. And the stronger you get, the higher that number is. So like you looking at like male professional triathletes or cyclists, like, they're going to be like maybe 400 or 500. Maybe somewhere. So there's a wide range. So you've got, the average person maybe like around 100. Then you've got somebody that's a pretty strong age grouper. Their FTP may be somewhere like between 200 to 300, depending on if they're male or female. Just to give you kind of a concept of what that looks like. And so, and that number, to be clear, that number, that is telling you how strong your legs are and what your legs can do. That number doesn't change based on like terrain. And so the reason that your functional threshold power, like what your power is, does not reflect speed is because if your legs are telling you I can hold 100 watts for an hour, then it doesn't matter if you're on flat road or if you're on a hill, they're still going to hold 100 watts. And obviously, on a flat, you're going to be much faster at 100 watts than you would be on a hill at 100 watts. And so people conflate the two and it gets really confusing. They aren't the same thing. There's very specific and minimal times I will ever use speed on the bike. I'm not going to even talk about that now, but speed is not really a great measurement on the bike for a lot of reasons. Getting back to the FTP, the way that we measure that in cycling is that you do like a 20-minute all-out test. The reason we only do 20 minutes is because for someone to actually, that 20-minute test is projecting what you would be able to hold for an hour at threshold. Rarely does somebody do an actual hour test because a lot of people actually can't. And the recovery for that's just a nightmare. So if you want to get like, you're using that 20-minute test as sort of like a field test, like just to kind of keep tabs on where things are. But I want to talk about it today because people think it's the holy grail. Like people get obsessed with what their FTP is. And it's like this 20-minute test, and then you actually only take 95% of that number. So if you measure 100 watts for a 20-minute all-out test, your FTP or functional threshold power would be protected at 95 because you take 95% of that number because they assume it's going to drop if you actually extend it for an hour. But people get obsessed with that because it's a reflection of kind of how strong you are. It would be like using your 5K and running and like your 5K time, and like how impressive is your 5K? Well, how impressive is your FTP? But the thing about that is that people use that in a way that it wasn't really intended. And it was interesting. I actually took a clinic with the guy who kind of came. So Andy Coggan is the guy who is known for sort of not inventing, but like he's known for the FTP test and then the zones that and the ranges that come from the FTP test. And
training zones, you mean?
That you would then get from that number. Okay. So like if you're measured at, let's say your FTP is 95, that would give you an estimate of what you could hold for an hour. And then from that, you would take like all of your what's called training zones. And so then you would be able to estimate, well, if I'm going to go for 6 hours, what percentage of that FTP can I use? If I want to work on my VO2 max or my aerobic capacity, then I would use like, a certain percentage of my FTP. So it's a number that's important because we do then gauge a lot of training decisions from that number.
Yes.
Okay. So, but people get hung up on the FTP and sort of lose sight of how you use it in a practical way. It's not like it doesn't matter what your FTP is if you're training for a 6-hour Ironman, right? It's important because it guides your training. And yes, it'll give you some sense of like, if somebody's FTP is 100 versus like 500, it's going to give you kind of an indication of what sort of capacity they may have as an athlete, but it very much depends on the training. It's like if you go out and run a 5K and somebody runs a 15-minute 5K, you could estimate, well, they may have a very good chance of doing quite a, of this marathon time, right? Versus if they run a 45-minute 5K, then this might be their projected marathon time. But none of that happens without the training.
Right. And it's only it's one of the data points that you as a coach just use that you use to help the athletes achieve their goals.
Well,
it is not running around and saying, I've got this number and this is all so indicative of who I am as an athlete.
Which is what happens. Like people they run around
because
and it
becomes
a test. Because it's a test, right? And really like one of my favorite things that Andy Coggan said is like the training is the test and the test is the training, meaning you are always looking at like what somebody's doing in training and then deriving their next goals from that. In that 20-minute FTP test, people get really nervous for it. They get really hung up on it. And then people talk about their FTP test when it's, it's a good baseline and it's something that can be helpful, but it is not the holy grail. And that's kind of how it's hung up on. And so if you have somebody that, again, the two reasons that you do the FTP test and keeping aware of like, how do you practically use the number you get from your FTP test? Because it's great if your FTP number goes up, but like if you, for example, when I was training for Ironman, my FTP would go down because I would do, I would get stronger at the beginning of the season. My FTP might be, a certain thing because I've done like shorter, harder, I'm building strength in the beginning of the season. But then as you go longer, and I'm building out for like what's going to be a 5.5 hour ride, I'm then focusing on the kind of workouts that I need to do to make my 5.5 hour ride as fast and as strong as it can be, which means that like my 20-minute effort like isn't going to be the focus of my workout as I get closer to my races, right? And so it freaked me out for a little while. I'm like, my FTP, and it's not like it's going to plummet, but it's like people think you're doing all this training and so your FTP is going to go up and get really strong. Well, it really depends on what you're training for. If you're training for like, the ITU races or like a sprint or an Olympic, then yeah, it could very well go up because of the type of training you're doing. But if you're training for some of that really long stuff, then the type of workouts you need to do aren't targeting your FTP or that 20-minute test, they're targeting your race. And so it just is kind of like I feel like it looms over people and people get like this, it's the FTP and it's the FTP test and it means all of this stuff and people get wrapped around the axle. But it's like, well, practically, what is the number? And like, how do we use it? What does it actually mean? Like, it's a snapshot. How you felt on that day gives you some targets. You compare it with what your numbers are in training. You set some goals depending on where you are in the season and what your goals are for your race. Then you prescribe your workouts based on that and you look. But, and the thing is that like, for example, I was having a conversation with an athlete last night and like, she is an athlete that has a really strong top end. And what I mean by that is that she can crush her VO2 numbers and those are workouts that work like, usually they're like workouts that go somewhere between like 5 and 7 minutes and they're really hard, they're uncomfortable. If I go to hell, I will have to do VO2 workouts in the cold. Like that's my pre-decided hell. That's not my strong suit, right? My top numbers were never good. And for her, like our goal with her is that we don't necessarily need to like spend a lot of time strengthening that super top part, but we need to come down a little bit and work more like in, extending out the amount of time that she can hold a slightly slower pace. So like what's her
her powers.
Her powers.
Yeah.
So how can we, and so, I'm using those numbers in training to understand like her FDP may be this. And like maybe right now I'd have another athlete that needs to really work on their top end, but that's not what this athlete needs. So we're going to kind of bypass, do a little bit with that super top end, but then we're going to do work in the area where she really needs it, regardless of what her FTP is saying, knowing that she's building out for an Ironman. And so it's like, it's really way more, it's really trying to develop an understanding of like, what's that number telling you and how do you use it?
Yeah. So what we all need to do
Yeah.
is chill out when it comes to that. And they've hired you as their coach or some other coach, or even if they're working on it themselves and they're trying to use that, it's just one puzzle piece.
It's one puzzle piece. And so like trying to really like your goal with it, your takeaway would be like trying to understand what that number is telling you and how to use it for what you need, and work with that and try to get that and use the numbers you're getting in training to try to understand that.
I laugh because when you gave me that test, I was at a point where I think I just was gonna stop training for the sport, but it was shortly before that. I was still in it for a little bit, and I had recently gotten a power meter, and you're like, ooh, and you put the FTP test on there, and I never did it. Because I was like, no.
I know.
I can't. Right? I don't want to.
Right.
I don't like it's the same reason I will not. Someone asked me the other day, we lined up for this race. It was just like a local 5K. Yeah. It was the Brain one, the Amy Thompson one. Yeah, and we're standing at the starting line, and one of my buddies, well, actually, we interviewed him.
Yeah.
Pat, he asked me, what's your PR in the 5K? And I was like, I don't know, and I never will.
Yeah. Well,
because I am not interested in running that hard for that,
Well, and that's right. And so you learn but people get really they get really wrapped around, and there is an art to how you do an FTP test. Like there is a way to approach it that is like, but that's the point is that like it does not define who you are as an athlete or a human being or even all of your workouts, right? And so the goal is to like get away from that, and like if you're really interested in the FTP, then what is it actually telling you, and how, like, what is it telling you about the type of, about what you are as an athlete, like where your strengths and weaknesses are, and how does that fit into what race you want to do and where you need to get stronger and how you use those numbers.
Just a piece of information.
It's just a piece of information
that helps you train.
Yeah, it doesn't. You're not. It doesn't. It's not. It doesn't define who you are as a human being.
There you go.
Thanks so much for listening, and remember,
We are in this together. Until next time.